Hello team! In the previous lesson we created an app in Slack and configured incoming and outgoing webhooks. And we gradually moved to our goal to create an application that would help us to automate project management operations. And the next step towards our goal is to make sure that we can interact with GPT from the Slack channel that we also created in the previous lesson. So today we are going to have a lot of practical examples and we will make sure that we can talk to GPT and receive responses from it through the Slack. We are going to start the lesson from review of the application architecture. I am going to explain you how integration between our application, Slack, and GPT is going to look like on the simple scheme. Then I will show you how you can add the app to the channel, and I will make a demo of what we are going to implement during the lesson. Especially for this lesson, I prepared real web applications that integrate Slack and GPT. The biggest part of the lesson we are going to spend on a review of code examples in order to understand how all integrations work under the hood. We are going to learn the key attributes of Slack events payload in order you can understand which attributes you can use in your application. During the lesson we are going to use Slack Java SDK. So, after this lesson you will know how to use Slack Java SDK. Also, I will make a brief overview of Slack SDKs for other programming languages. And at the end of the lesson, we are going to learn what scopes in Slack are and configure all required scopes for our application. And also, we are going to set up a nice picture for our Slack application. Let's start our lesson. Let me start with a brief overview of what we are going to implement today. Basically, we will implement a simple flow. We post a message inside the Slack. Our web application receives the payload with the details of events that happened in Slack. We process the Slack's payload to extract all information needed in order to prepare a request to the GPT. We send a request to GPT. We receive response from GPT. And then we post response from GPT directly to the Slack channel. That is the simple and basic flow that we are going to implement in this lesson. And as I said at the beginning of the lesson, this is going to be the lesson full of practical examples and exercises. So let me jump directly to the screen sharing and code examples. Let me start with the demo of the expected result that we are going to achieve in this lesson. So, by the end of this lesson, we will be able to communicate with ChatGPT through the Slack interface. I can tag my application and send a message. GPT, hey, that's what I wrote. And I expect to receive response. And another important thing, I can chat with GPT from any channel where I added my app. As you can see, I can also receive response from an OpenAI channel. How to add app to the channel? There are a few ways to do this. Let me show you on the example of general channel. The first option is to click on the channel name in the header, select Integrations tab, click button Add an app, and find an app that you wanna add to the channel. You can see that there is already GPT app in my workspace, so I can easily add it if I wish. The second option to add app integration to the channel, in case it is already present in the workspace, is just tag it in the message. Let me show you. I write a message and I tag GPT. As you can see, Slack offers me to add GPT to the channel. Just invite GPT and that's it. Integration is created and now you can use GPT from this channel too. I wrote code in such way that it will reply to the channel where a question was asked. As usual, you can find source code examples and attachments to this lesson. But in order to explain you how everything works here, let me show you how the code works line by line. So, I started my Spring Boot app. It is up and running. Everything begins in the class that is called Slack Integration Controller. In the previous lesson, we used this endpoint when we configured subscription to app mentioning event. That's why we receive payload from Slack in this method. Pay attention how this method is written, because I need to return 200 OK status back to Slack, confirming that I received an event. In case Slack wouldn't receive confirmation within 3 seconds or so, it will make a retry attempt. And we don't want to receive the same events multiple times. That's why I run event processing in the separate thread. You can see that I used class completable future in order to kick off new thread. If you want to learn more about multithreading in Java, just to remind you that I have course Java from Zero to First Job, where I publish separate and solid section about multithreading in Java. There was a separate lesson about completable future too. That's why I wouldn't stop too much explaining the details about multithreading in Java. You can also see here callback in whenComplete method. It is here to notify us about exception in the thread. So in case some exception will be thrown in the thread, we will print the details to the stack trace. And of course, team, like I teach my students in the lessons about best practices, it is recommended to use logger and log all the exceptions in the configured logger. But taking into account we have learning sessions in the style of active development, I believe that it would be easier for you to observe errors and details directly in the console. But of course, when we will go to production, we need to clean this up and configure proper logging. Okay, so we agreed on this. I return from the method empty string, because the main thing for Slack is to receive 200 OK status. And that is default response status, that's why I don't specify anything special here. We need to process payload that we received from Slack. In order to process the payload, let's look at it in order to understand what information we can find there. On the slide you can see formatted view of the payload from Slack. Let me make a brief overview of it and highlight the key points about its structure and main properties. My goal is to help you to understand which properties might be useful for building your own application and how potentially you can use them in your application. As you can see, the payload is a JSON object containing various properties. It represents an event callback received from Slack when your app is mentioned. Let's review important properties now. Token. A unique token representing the authentication of the Slack app. Team ID. The ID of the Slack team where the event occurred. API app ID. The ID of the Slack app associated with the event. That's the one that we created in the previous lesson. Because potentially you can have one web application and build custom processing logic for events from different Slack applications. Event. An object containing details about the specific event that triggered the callback. In our today's example, most of the required information will parse from this object. Type. The type of event, which in this case is app mention. You can use the value from this field to build different logic for processing of different types of events. So far on this stage we have only one type of event. That's why it is obvious for me that all events that I will receive are app mentions events. Text. The text of the message that mentioned the app. Pay attention here to the message. You can see that in case there was a mention, it has specific format in text. Namely, user ID is used. Like this, it is not clear who is mentioned here, and whether it makes some sense for the context in general. Because imagine that in case you mentioned few team members in the same message and ask GPT when they will finish their tasks according to plan. In this case, we would need to handle mapping between user IDs and names if we would consider that this is important for the context, in order GPT can recognize the mentioned people. Today in the lesson I am going to handle this case. Namely, I am going to fetch from Slack information about user by its ID that I can see here. Take the real name of user associated with this ID and substitute it in the text before sending prompt to the GPT. Is it clear? And remember team, in case you have any questions, don't wait. Ask them instantly below this video and I will be happy to answer. User attribute. It contains the ID of the user who sent the message. This is also important information for us. When we will build history of messages, it is nice to specify author of each message, in order to give to GPT as much context as we can. But pay attention that we have ID here again. so we would need to resolve author name too. TS, the timestamp of the message. Might be a good idea to use timestamp in order to track the time of event and message. Blocks. An array of blocks representing the message's content and structure. This is for more advanced message content analysis. Team. The ID of the team where the event occurred. Channel. The ID of the channel where the message was posted. Event TS. The timestamp of the event. And you remember that previously we had field that is called TS. So what is the difference? Basically, TS is associated with the message that triggered the event. It helps to identify when message was posted, but event TS refers to the timestamp of event callback itself. Represents the timestamp of the overall event that occurred within Slack. Type indicates that this payload represents an event callback, but obviously different types can be here. Event ID, the ID of the specific event within the team. Event time, the timestamp of the event. You can see that it is just a little bit different format. In event TS we have better precision, and this is regular Unix time format. Authorizations, an array containing information about authorized users for the app. Based on this content, you can see that we use ID of our bot associated with the application. It was created automatically. IsExt shared channel indicates whether the event occurred in the externally shared channel. An externally shared channel in Slack refers to a channel that is shared between two separate Slack workspaces or organizations. It allows users from different workspaces to collaborate and communicate within the same channel, providing a way to bridge communication between different teams or organizations. So, now you know the structure of Slack's payload. The next thing that we are going to do is to parse relevant information that we need. Send request to GPT, receive response from GPT, and send response back to the Slack. Let's continue. Let's get back to our example now. I'm going to explain you what is happening inside process on mention event method. As you can see, this is the method of Slack service that I injected into the controller. Slack service is just an interface that declares a contract for two methods so far. They are process on mention event that we are going to review today and remove all messages from channel. The second method is for development purposes. It helps me to keep history of the channel clean, because there are a lot of iterations of debugging, and instead of removing channel and creating new, I created API that allows me to remove all messages from the channel. There is one implementation of this interface that is called default Slack service. Let's understand what is going on there inside. I call method extract Slack request data. According to the developed API here, I expect to receive Slack request data object that should contain author name, the message itself, and the channel ID where this message came from. Inside extract Slack request data method, with the help of JSON library, I convert request body string into JSON object. We already learned the structure, so I bet you remember that in Slack's payload we had event object, and inside that object we had text attribute. So I extract text value. That is our message. Separately, I extract ID of the author of the message. Also, I need to extract channel ID in order to know where to reply. In this line, I extract user ID to username's map. Why do I need this? You remember that when we reviewed Slack payload, we noticed that Slack mentions are just user IDs with specific markup around, and also you don't have the name of the author of the message. We just have the ID. In order to get the name by ID, I need this map. In the extract user ID to name map method, I use Slack SDK for Java. So, first of all, I need to add a dependency in the POM.xml. Let me open POM.xml. Here you will find new dependency that I added. You can find it in Maven wrapper, This is official software development kit for Java by Slack. But what to do in case you want to develop application using other programming language? No worries. Slack released SDK for different programming languages. Slack provides SDK for Java, Python, JavaScript Node.js, Ruby, Go, PHP, .NET C#. And remember that you always have an option to interact with Slack using API and simple HTTP requests. Do you remember in the previous lesson we configured incoming webhook? And there was the URL that you can use to send messages to the Slack. So, no matter whether you will build your integration using incoming webhook URL or specially developed SDK, you can do it in one of these ways. But I recommend you to use developed SDK because it can optimize lines of codes, it has built-in authorization and authentication support, and sometimes can even optimize amount of requests that you do. Also, incoming webhook allows you to post messages to the configured channel, but with the Slack Java SDK, you can post to any channel. This can be important for your business logic. So, after adding this dependency to the POM XML, we need to configure methods client bean. I open bean's configuration class. Here you can see that I used Slack API to configure bean of methods client. I used security token that was generated in the Slack in the previous lesson. The token that you need to paste here you can find in the OAuth and permissions menu. It is generated right after you installed the app into the workspace. You need to get bot user OAuth token. In case you can see user OAuth token, don't touch it so far. In this lesson we need bot user OAuth token only. What is user OAuth token and when to use it, we're going to learn in the next lessons. You already know that all secret codes and secret tokens you need to store in Secrets Management tool. So, that's why you will not find my secret token in the repository, and you would need to add your own token manually here, in case you would like to run my application and my source code. We are going to use this bean each time we need to send requests to the Slack. And now I come back to the default Slack service, and you can see that I injected bean of the methods client here. I also injected the bean of methods client created based on the user OAuth token. It is needed for implementation of another method that deletes all messages in channel. We are going to review it in the next lesson, so don't pay attention to it now. And coming back to the method where we stopped, extract user ID to name map, pay attention how I built request to Slack. I use class usersListRequest, call builder, and call build method. In the Slack API client library, there are similar types for different Slack entities. We are going to learn them gradually, because it would be hard for you to remember all of them in case I would start review now. Then I use methods client and call method userList and pass my users list request. You can spend some more time exploring this API, for example exploring different types, open builders in order to understand better what properties you can set while building requests for different entities. Learning programming is also about spending time reading documentation and source code. Then I create map and iterate over all users that I received in response. I populate map with entries, where the key would be user ID and the value would be real name. In case you would have other business needs requirements, you can store in memory the whole object of user if you wish. But for our requirements today, it is enough to store just IDs and real names. In case some error happens, I return empty map. So, let's get back to the extract Slack request data method. Now we have map with the user IDs to user names mapping. Now we can easily extract name of the author of the message from the map. And I wrote special method to substitute all IDs and mentions in the text of the message. This will help GPT to understand context better. Not sure whether you want me to go over each line of this algorithm. Anyway, you would have the reference to the source code, and you can explore the source code slowly. In short, I just extract all user ID mentions using the regular expression. It is not hard thing to do because Slack uses special syntax for mentions, and then iterate over each user ID and extract the real name from the map and substitute it in the text. As a result, I return the same message but with the substituted user IDs. Now I have only real names in text and no user IDs. Now I have all necessary data in order to build Slack request data object. Once I have Slack request data, I call method in GPT service. I created one more method that overloads existing one with additional parameter. GetAnswer to single query method now accepts the name of the user. If you would explore the source code of default GPT service, you're going to find that I did small refactoring here. I moved the common code to the method prepareRequest, because in these two cases, the only difference would be messages list preparation. One more important thing here. I bet you remember from the lesson when we learned OpenAI GPT API that there are some limitations on the name value. There is a strict pattern of values that can be used. The name attribute may contain AZ characters, both lowercase, uppercase, digits from 0 to 9, and underscores with a maximum length of 64 characters. Consider this while implementing your own app. In my case, names are written in English, but still, sometimes I may have a space in the full real name of the user. That's why I substitute all spaces with underscores. Everything else remains the same like we did in the previous lessons. So, request is sent to the GPT. We received response from the GPT. When we have response from the GPT in the default Slack service, the only thing that is left to do is to send the response back to the channel from where request came from. I call sendMessageToSlack method. I pass the response from the GPT and channel ID from which I received the request. According to this implementation, I can reply in any channel where my bot is added. And here again, I use Slack SDK. I create object of chat post message request using builder. I set the channel ID and text that I wanna post. Taking into account our Slack message client being is already authenticated, the only thing that I need to do is to invoke chat post message and pass my request. After this, we receive response in our Slack. Isn't this cool? Basically, that's all changes that I did in our web application. But in order everything would work and you can reproduce the whole scenario end to end, we need to do few more configurations in the Slack. We need to configure scopes in Slack. But let's first understand what scopes are. In the context of Slack, scopes are a way to define and control the permissions granted to apps when accessing various features and data within a Slack workspace. Scopes determine what an app can do and access on behalf of users or within a workspace. Each scope represents a specific set of permissions that an app can request from Slack's API. By specifying the required scopes when installing or authorizing an app, you define the level of access the app will have to interact with the Slack platform. When developing a Slack app, it is important to understand the available scopes and request only the scopes necessary for your app's functionality. This helps ensure a clear and transparent user experience and maintains the security and privacy of Slack workspaces. Anyway, in case some scopes will be missing, you are going to see error message from the Slack telling you what exact scope is missing for this action, and you would need to add it. On this slide, you can see example of the error message and full list of scopes that we need for this lesson. So we need to add such scopes: groups read, mpim read, im read, users read, app mentions read, chat write bot. Let me show you where you need to add scopes. Just open your app at api-slack.com and select Allows and Permissions. On this page, you can find your tokens that you have to use in order to authenticate with Slack SDK API client, but below it you can find scopes. There are two sections. There are bot token scopes and user token scopes. Bot tokens are associated with Slack apps and represent the functionality and capabilities of the app within a workspace. Bot token scopes define the permissions and access that the app has within a Slack workspace. User tokens are associated with individual Slack users and represent their own access and permissions within a workspace. User token scopes define the permissions and access that the user has within their own workspace account. These scopes determine what actions the user can perform. So for our today's lesson, we need to add bot token scopes. Just use Add an Allows Scope button and add all required scopes that we have discussed and that you can see on the screen. Also, I added picture to our app. It is super easy. If you want, you can add picture too. Just go to the basic information and scroll to the bottom. You can add picture here. Basically, that's it. That's all what I wanted to show you in this lesson. Let's recap what we have learned today. In this lesson, we learned example of web applications that integrates Slack and GPT. Now you know how to add the app to the channel. We learned how Slack event payload looks like and you know key attributes from the payload. I explained you how to use Slack Java SDK. Also, now you know what scopes in Slack are, and we configured all required scope of our Slack app. And small thing, but also important one, we configured a picture for our app. We should never forget about small things, because small things matter a lot. That's it. Thanks a lot for your attention. Have a great day and see you in the next lesson.